Bellegarde, my friends, my relatives, I'm very happy to be here, and I greet you all in a humble, respectful way. I acknowledge our Creator for this beautiful day. My name is Perry Bellegarde, and I'm National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, representing 634 First Nations across Canada, with 1.4 million citizens from 58 different Indigenous nations. I'm a member of Little Black Bear First Nations, Treaty 4 territory, and I'm a citizen of the Cree Nation. Today, I am also speaking on behalf of several Indigenous peoples and human rights organizations with whom we work in coalition. We greet you all in a humble, respectful way. I would also like to acknowledge and greet the hereditary leadership from the Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, Haida, and the Tsimshian nations, and all the other Indigenous nations here today. We commend Canada for announcing the unqualified support for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I lift up and hold up Ministers Jody Wilson-Raybould and Minister Carolyn Bennett for their statements this past week. This is a critical step to achieving a just and lasting reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and Canada. Now, we look forward to the hard work of translating that expression of support into action as full partners, both in Canada and internationally. To that end, we welcome the study of the Permanent Forum on Procedural Rules. For us, this is the modern expression of the doctrine of discovery. First Nations know that procedural violations often lead to substantive violations, and we will not accept states defining our rights in our absence or holding discussions while we observe in silence. Since we last gathered here, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada submitted its final report and 94 calls to action. The Commission called upon the federal government, among others, to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, has agreed to implement all the calls to action. Full implementation of the United Nations Declaration will require long-term commitment and collaboration. We need the United Nations Declaration because so many of the laws and policies affecting the lives of Indigenous peoples rest on the foundations of colonialism and racism. And as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reminded us over and over again, that reconciliation is going to take hard work. After decades of non-recognition and denial of rights of the Indigenous peoples, we know Indigenous peoples must be full partners in the reform of state laws and policies. The United Nations Declaration provides a framework for the law and policy reform needed to ensure justice and achieve reconciliation, harmonious relations, and lasting peace. Member states have repeatedly denied that Indigenous peoples have the right to exercise self-determination with regard to the development of our lands, our territories, and resources, even when that development threatens our food sources, our cultures, our security, and our survival as distinct peoples. Such actions have threatened the peace between our peoples. Former Special Rapporteur James Anaya concluded in 2012, natural resource extraction and development on or near Indigenous territories had become one of the foremost concerns of Indigenous peoples worldwide, and possibly also the most pervasive source of the challenges to the full exercise of their rights. Recognizing Indigenous peoples' human rights, including the free, prior, and informed consent to development on our traditional lands and territories, will lead to greater peace and security for all. Free, prior and informed consent, very simply, is the right to say yes to developments or the right to say no. And it is much more than a process of consultation. I bring to your attention the recommendation of the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights made to Canada earlier this year. They recommended that the state party fully recognize the right to free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples in its laws and policies and apply it in practice. In particular, it recommends that the state party establish effective mechanisms that enable meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making in relation to development projects being carried out on or near their lands or territories. The committee also recommends that the state party effectively engage Indigenous peoples in the formulation of legislation that affects them. Implementing the United Nations Declaration as a framework for reconciliation will usher in an era based on justice, recognition of rights, and partnership. It will return us to the relationships entered into by our ancestors. Treaty relationships founded on peace, security, and prosperity for all in Canada and beyond. Peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between our peoples is the foundation of our relationship. Indigenous peoples are calling for the full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration by Canada through a legislative framework. The Private Member's Bill C-262, tabled by Indigenous Member of Parliament Romeo Saganash, is a floor for action. We welcome the discussions on how best to build upon the foundation in this bill to achieve peace, justice, and well-being. We recommend 4 things. All states honor the commitments made in the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, including the commitment to respect, promote, and advance and in no way diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples. Also, national action plans are to be developed in cooperation with Indigenous peoples to implement the United Nations Declaration. Number 2, legislative frameworks for implementing the United Nations Declaration affirm its central significance in the process of national reconciliation. Such implementation would highlight the importance of harmonizing state laws consistent with the United Nations Declaration. 3, national laws, regulations, and policies, especially those dealing with resource development, be reformed to ensure that the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples is required for any decisions that have the potential for serious impacts on the environment and on our rights. And lastly, that states and Indigenous peoples should monitor and report on progress being made on the ongoing implementation of the United Nations Declaration. Thank you so much for listening, Mr. Chairman. Egoze.